All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Adams van Sail, here to shine a light on the goings-on here at the southern tip of Africa. And here to join me again here tonight for that mission is Robert Duigan, a face that I think the vast majority of my audience definitely recognize, except if you've subscribed only in the past few weeks. And tonight we're going to be discussing opinion piece that Rob wrote for his publication, The Cape Independent, and that piece's title is the title of tonight's stream, and that is The Afrikaner Veto and the Fourth Dispensation. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. I really enjoyed the piece, so I like to give Rob the opportunity to actually elaborate on some of the ideas in it. And this conversation format usually brings about a lot more, a lot of extra insights into people's writing. So welcome back on the show, Rob. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, hello. Nice to be here.
So let's start off with a little bit of an introduction. We've entered the GNU era, the Government of National Unity. Unity and harmony and kumbaya are the themes that we are constantly seeing from the commentariat. A lot of people's arguments have changed into anything goes as long as it preserves the harmony and the unity. But it seems at the moment that that means that even a lot of bad policies that before the election were key sticking points for many of the parties that now form part of the GNU, a lot of red lines, literal red lines, that was what they were called, are being threatened. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of resistance to it. I think one of the things that appears to have happened is a little bit of opposition capture. I've seen a lot of people argue that, for example, when the Solidarity Movement, which includes AfriForum, when we came out and said if the Bella Bill or the Bella law were to be implemented, that the parties that drew a red line there should reconsider their relationship within the Government of National Unity. I mean, there are some people, a small minority, but some people reacted and said that, no, this is not worth it. Think about the GDP, think about the harmony, think about the vibes. And that's just not a compelling argument to me. And my response my response to that
Magnus Haystack, who's usually very, very like serious and detail oriented, he came up with the vibes argument, and I thought, oh goodness, you know, I don't know. I think, you know, I pause before I criticize someone who knows what he's doing quite as much as Magnus Haystack, but I'm used to expecting a little more detail, and so it said to me, how should I put this? There's a tendency that we know a lot of people who are in the mainstream in South Africa, and even outside of it, you know, there's this whole thing of mandatory optimism, right? And every political cycle takes on a subtly new flavor, but you have to be optimistic. And like last time around was, oh, Ramaphosa is going to fix everything. No, he was completely rubbish. Okay, well now we've got the DA in government. Everything's going to go well. They're going to look after the economy. ANC won't get up to their usual shenanigans. And I mean, the worst part was that, remember that speech, it was not too long ago, it was a couple of weeks ago, John Steenhuisen did at the press club. And I mean, he waffled for a bit, but the key takeaway over there was that they're not going to leave the GNU unless the ANC scraps the constitution or tanks the economy. And the thing is, even those, because there's a lot of slipperiness to those definitions. I mean, what does it mean to really sort of, you know, discard the constitution? Does it mean they ignore a court ruling? Does it mean they try to amend the constitution? You know, how, or does it mean that they?
I would say the Bella Bill in itself is a shredding of the 1994 compromise when it comes to language rights and the protection of minority education or minority language education. And but my response to a lot of
the betrayal of promises. The betrayal of promises is very clear. Yeah. Like we understand the spirit in which. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to make a quick sort of distinction here. Is that I have this theory, and I'd like to flesh it out at some time. It shouldn't take too long, but I never get around to it. is that I think that if you look at like the document on which CODISA was founded, there's a lot of talk about equality, but I get the impression that the conservative factions and the liberal factions interpreted this as to mean equality before the law, whereas the ANC understood it to mean material equality, leveling process. And it's just ambiguously worded enough that you can understand why they both saw it differently. And so I suspect they don't feel like they're actually betraying the deal. What they're doing is carrying it out, and we are sort of getting sour grapes about what we agreed to. And so I think that I actually suspect that might be the case.
But I mean, the response really is very simple to anyone that says, but think about the vibes or think about the 0.1% increase in GDP growth. And that is, well, how Solidarity and AfriForum are reacting is how you react when you genuinely see a piece of legislation as an actual existential threat and not just something that you call an existential threat as part of a election campaign or as part of fear mongering. When you actually believe that something is a threat to your community and to your culture and to your language, then you really draw a red line and say, if this red line is crossed, there will be serious consequences, not just finger wagging and angry pieces of letters and written to the person that's stepping over the line.
No, look, that's very true. But I think this is kind of where I got, where I sort of took my cue from. Is I was looking at, because I made a prediction 2 years ago. I wrote this big long article. I had one meeting with Helen Ziller at her house, and I think she thought I was looking for a job posting in the DA, whereas I have a tendency where if I think I can trust someone, I take a very naive stance with them, and I didn't know enough about how she politically operated at the time, and so I did have this kind of sense of trust. I know it's kind of silly, but to trust politicians, but she appeared to be being very open-handed, and I sort of approached her and I said, well, somewhere like an hour into the conversation, she asked me, well, what do you want out of this meeting? And I said, well, actually, I want to convince you that to make steps towards Cape independence and to not go into a coalition with the ANC, because I'd heard some noises that sounded like potentially they might be doing that. And she sort of obviously said, okay, well, Cape independence means civil war, so we're not going to do that. But a coalition with the ANC won't happen unless they meet certain conditions. And they made a coalition with them despite the ANC not meeting any conditions. In fact, they extracted concessions from the DA. And what I predict, the thing is, what I predicted shortly afterwards, after she spoke at that BizNews conference, where she basically painted a little triangle and made an argument for why it's existentially necessary to form a coalition with the ANC, but then held back from actually stating the conclusion. And I thought, I can see exactly where this argument's going. So I wrote a big long article where I sort of implored her, please don't do this, because, look, in retrospect, I can sort of go, yeah, they didn't really have much option. You kind of have to form a coalition with the ANC. Because, look, the alternative was Cape independence, and there was no way they were really going to be able to implement that without completely shattering the party. So, yeah, there's certain realities one has to accept. But as it moved forward, one of the big things I predicted is that the DA, because the DA has no leverage. The ANC can at any point just go, yeah, but we've got dozens of other suitors. We can form a coalition with whoever we please. So the DA is not in a position to extract any concessions from the ANC, and at least not on a parliamentary basis. And there's this idea that we had with the GNU that all of the parties, and now we've got a situation where all the parties that represent various ethnic groups in South Africa are represented. So the DA, fairly broad-based, multiracial middle class, so on and so forth, representing about 4% of the black electorate, the vast majority of the white electorate, most of the colored electorate, most of the Indian electorate. The DA is supposed to represent minorities, right? And
one development that's actually what it happened before your piece, but I mean, you can see where resistance in the end is coming from when it comes when
Maybe.
the when
Sorry,
the
I have a small
that's no
interruption
problem.
here.
That's part of fatherhood. One of the elements that was very clear here is the fact that when it comes to where is
Right.
opposition in
I
the
promise I'll be
GNU
right
coming
back.
from,
I'm sorry.
no problem. When where does opposition in the GNU come from, or in the GNU era come from? What do you do when the opposition parties have been absorbed into the government? Well, then the opposition benches are taken over by the EFF and the Umkhonto weSizwe, and that will pull the politics and the political environment in a leftward direction. But on top of that, you also have a situation where now, to preserve the vibes, to preserve the harmony, to preserve the unity, the U in the GNU, that means we can't, the parties within the GNU can't really stir the pot too much or cause too much ruckus or really make too much of a scene. So they go along with many of these policies, and therefore the new opposition will have to come from organizations, from community-based organizations, from civil society, and that's already taking shape in the fact that Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, called Dirk Herman and Kali Kriel to discuss the Bella Bill. In this, when the 3 months were announced, that in a 3-month period had been identified within which those two clauses regarding language, specifically in schools, that those two clauses will still be further negotiated. Ramaphosa came to the negotiating table where Kali Kriel and Dirk Herman were sitting. So now we have 3 months to see what happens there. And from as insider information, I can tell you there's a lot happening, and there is a lot that's still going to happen between now and the end of those 3 months. The Bella Bill is genuinely an existential threat for the solidarity movement and AfriForum, and there's a lot that we're willing to do to stop something that we genuinely see as such a threat.
Yeah, sorry to do technical nonsense now. I just have
no
to
problem.
check what's my
But Rob,
microphone
on that
quality now?
note, I wanted to ask you particularly, within what context, what prompted you to write this particular piece to kind of direct the conversation a bit more in that direction? What prompted you to put this on the table?
Yeah, it's literally the bit that you just said. So it's sorry, I just wanted to ask you quickly: is my microphone functioning? Because I don't know if it's okay. Good, because it disconnected briefly.
I can hear you. I don't know if it's your onboard microphone or the one that you're speaking into, but I can hear you.
If it sounds rubbish, then I probably have deselected my very nice microphone. Nope, I've got the right one.
Definitely the one. All right. But Rob,
so
fill in the gaps, anything that I missed, and paint that picture of the context within which you wrote this piece.
No, it's literally just the thing that you said, which is that the DA couldn't get anything done. And then John Steenhuisen acted on his own to sort of get the ANC to talk to you guys, because he was, there was nothing they could do. They had no leverage, they had no influence. The ANC looks at them like they're part of the furniture. And so, the interesting thing for me is that the ANC that weren't willing to listen to the DA are willing to listen to the Solidarity movement. And they, so much so that you guys managed to get them to hold back on the promulgation of 2 articles of a law that's already signed in. So he has no reason to halt the process. He can just say it's out of my hands, but he chose not to. Now, this seems like a kind of small event. I mean, forget the power-wise, it seems like a small event. Obviously, it has big implications for Afrikaans language, education, etc. But power-wise, to most people, I don't think it would register as very big. But I think the fact that you guys have been handed effectively a veto on certain parts of legislation is, I mean, there's no telling whether this will hold. They might decide, actually, no, there's no reason to take you guys seriously, or you don't know what's going to happen in the future. But based on the idea that this might represent an emerging pattern, I speculated about the logic of power that might emerge. Now, the first things that I did on the internet that anyone noticed were like a series of little documentary type things, like little video essays on South African history, where I broke the history into like 3 different categories, 3 different eras of the Union, where there was a specific logic of power that governed. I mean, there's commonalities between all of them. There's, and there's and so on, but there is like a different arrangement under every, what I call dispensation, and they don't cleanly break into one another as much as you'd think. So there's a long period of reform during Afrikaner nationalism from 1977 till 1994, where they're moving towards the next system. There's a long period of adjustment from the unionist government under Jan Smuts towards the Afrikaner nationalist period. So you can start that clock ticking from, 1924 up until they lose to the Reform National Party. So it's not like there's these clean breaks either, but there's this idea that whatever system of government's is in place, and we tend to have these long-standing systems. There's this idea that here's the logic along which your society functions. Here's what you are owed. You understand? And I see. I think Ramaphosa really captured what the current dispensation was really about when he decided that it was over. So one of the first speeches that he gave when he became president was, he said that the second phase of the National Democratic Revolution is now in progress. So now, people who don't know, the National Democratic Revolution, it's a certain idea that South African communists in 1928 adapted to the South African system from Lenin's theory of revolution. So there's like these 2 phases. First, you gain political power, and then you use that political power to create socialism, right? And so what Ramaphosa kind of did when he came to power is he said to everyone in his supporter base, he said, listen, like, okay, now we have proper political control. We have actually captured enough of the private sector. We've captured enough of civil society. We've got enough international support that we can begin going through the process of actually implementing socialism. And like, there's a lot of fudge. I think I think when you listen to too much American politics, I mean, look, I'm guilty of this as well, where I'll abuse the boundaries of the concept a little bit. But socialism, the way they mean it, is vastly different from anything that's done in the West that could be called social democracy or anything like that, right?
No, it's for example the abolishment of private medical schemes. That's
well, yeah, it's the seizure. It's basically the seizure of the economy by the state. That's kind of the point. And so, I mean,
like
look, there's a bunch of reform.
Without compensation. It's things like
Correct.
the
So there's a bunch
Bella
of
things like NHI.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of little modules that he's got going. It's expropriation without compensation. That's sitting on his desk. He's waiting to sign it. This is like his big nuclear bomb that he's sitting on. Then you've got the National Health Insurance Act that's going to bankrupt everyone in the country and destroy our medical industry overnight. Then you've got the Bella Bill, where now people talk about Afrikaans, and of course that's extremely important, but I still think the most dangerous element of it is that it takes away the ability to set admission standards for high schools. And what that means is overnight, every high school which previously had a really high standard of education is going to be completely deluged in the dumbest and most unruly kids in the entire world. You're not going to be able to hold your school together at all, and the differences in the differences in intellectual ability, innate intellectual ability between one person and another varies a lot. And if you don't take students who are capable of handling a decent quality of schooling workload, you're not going to be able to teach them. And it drags everyone down because the teachers have to sit and obsess over trying to catch the slow kids up. If you don't have this kind of differentiation, you literally cannot have functioning schools that produce intellectuals who can enter tertiary education. We struggle with that already. I mean, the dropout rate between admission and graduation is just enormous. I can't remember statistics off the top of my head right now, but it doesn't look good. So yeah, it would actually be really horrific. And they've held off on implementing most of this until the start of next year because you're having intakes are happening right now. So next year people won't notice any difference, and they'll think, hey, what was this Bella Bilkach about? It doesn't mean anything, 2026, they are going to absolutely bleed from their eyeballs with fear. Because the changes in the character of all of your elite schools are going to be extremely dramatic if this cannot be fixed, if it cannot be prevented. So, yeah, I think. Back to the main thesis. I think what I saw emerging, there's this interesting theory, right? There's a political theory that this Dutch fellow came up with called Arend. His name's Arend Leipert, and he came up with this theory in the 1960s that, in a funny sort of way, is a criticism of liberal civic constitutionalism, and because there's this idea that we have, going back to the American founding constitution, and everything. Oh, you create all of these different checks and balances and all of that. But the reality is, and I mean, Koos Malan, the leading intellectual light of the movement at the moment, as his main thesis is generally that these checks and balances don't actually function like they say they do. They only really function if the sort of governing class is a little bit divided on who to back. Where they're in agreement on issues, the institutions just rubber stamp whatever position the ruling class wants. So if there's a consensus of values, regardless of what the broader population want, they can just do what they like almost indiscriminately. And what Leipert points out, he doesn't state any of that kind of stuff openly, but there's an implied criticism there in that he says that the best way to actually do checks and balances when you don't actually have a homogenous society. And people forget the Netherlands wasn't a homogenous society. It had distinctions between Protestant and Catholic and North and South, and the labor movement and the liberals and all of that. And the people would be channeled into these silos in society. And so you'd have people who they live in this sort of Labour Party world where, and I have a close friend who comes from that Labour Party background. He's a bit of a reactionary at the moment, but he's his dad's a fairly senior judge, and it's like if you're from the Labour Party, you go to this school and you read this newspaper, and it's not like that really anymore, but it used to be, at least in Arend Leipert's time. So this idea of, okay, you have these different clusters in society that have different values, and they function in their own little silos, and each silo has to negotiate at the center for rights that work for everybody. And of course, the Dutch, being a very old community that's been dealing with themselves for a very long time, they know how to do this on an purely informal basis, right? So, but when you get to the rest of the world, and you're like, okay, South Africa, in 1994, you've all of a sudden slapped people who have like oceans of cultural difference apart in terms of political culture, spirituality, ideas of friend and enemy and political interest and everything. And before this happened, Leipert looks at it and he goes, well, actually, you know what you guys need is you need a system where every population group is represented in parliament and has the ability to say no to anything that would hurt their interests, So the National Party tried to do something like that, but it's one of those things that you can't do piecemeal. Because if you try and do it a little bit at a time instead of going all the way, then what you've really created is like, it's like what we get with a tricameral parliament, where you're throwing them crumbs instead of giving them a seat at the table. And I think everyone sort of kind of saw it for that. And the route of reform towards consociationalism really failed because it's something you have to do all at once. And if they didn't do it by 1980, it would have never happened.
I'm just going to put that concept on the screen, so anyone that wants to go research for themselves. I mean, it might not be the most obvious word to just spell from just hearing it on the ear.
It's kind of boring. And I mean, look, there are various governments who've tried very little things like that, whether, you know, in various different places in the world, and they've not, it's not always gone well. It's not like this actually solves the problem of, you know, a democratic constitution at all. Neither, there is no real magic fix as far as I'm concerned, to any political system. I mean, everything's muddling through. But he thought this would sort of keep the worst from happening in South Africa. And it's very funny because when I looked at the GNU coming together, I thought, well, this is very interesting because for the first time you have every population group is now represented in the parliament. And theoretically, if everyone was operating in good faith, it would actually end up functioning like a consociational government. Of course, we know the balance of forces don't really work out like that. So then you have this thing where Solidarity manages to say no to an already signed bill. I thought, well, good grief, that's
Solidarity
meaningful.
is not part of the government of national unity.
Correct. So, but I have this, one of the things I really like, one of the ideas I really like, and it's something that Koos Malan talks about, not in these terms, but he sort of points towards it in his writing. And it's something that even sort of, you know, fashionable thinkers like Curtis Yarvin have mentioned as well, is that you've got the difference between a codified constitution and then you've got the real living constitution. And in days gone by, that actually used to be how people described the state. When they talked about a constitution, they didn't mean, oh, well, here's this codified document like the USA. They meant, okay, well, this is actually how things get done in practice. And we don't do that anymore. We've gone to the route of saying, well, okay, you've got this codified document over here. That's the Constitution. You go look at that shiny thing right there for a minute. And then you forget about how things are really done. So how many people are really sort of very fluent in understanding how government departments launder their projects and their money through NGOs, you know, in order to support partisan interests? It's a standard pattern that was introduced in the 90s by the two Fabian heads of government in the West, you know, Clinton and Blair. So, and it's actually it's a very, very deeply rooted part of how governments function today, but it's not considered part of the Constitution. But in a similar way, so you look at South Africa now and you go, okay, Francois de Klerk, you have the dictionary definition perfect in front of you. Yes. But I was saying, where was I? Yes, no, solidarity. The thing is that you have a real chance here if you're careful about how you use this, where you can actually get the power to say no. And the thing is, because solidarity is a broader movement, if you tally up all the little organizations and all the members thereof, it does represent, depending on how you interpret those numbers, somewhere between a plurality and a majority of the households within the Afrikaner population, right? And I think that it's safe to say that it is sort of on the cusp of becoming something like a parallel government. What concerns me about this is that now you're a political player. And I think that we noticed this as well with AfriForum. For the first time in the organization's history, it dove into party politics when Kali Kriel stated that he thinks, you know, the DA and the Vryheidsfront should leave the coalition if the red lines are not adhered to. And there's I don't think there's any way in hell that the DA would leave the coalition. I think they'll tolerate literally anything the ANC do, right up to skinning children alive in the streets. I honestly believe that. I don't think they'll ever leave the GNU. But what's interesting is you could get the Vryheidsfront to leave if you put enough pressure. And my personal opinion is that if it would work out much better for you guys if the Vryheidsfront leave, they can place rightward pressure on the DA through the 2026 elections, because then they become the only opposition to the government on the right. And especially in the Western Cape, this is a very, very powerful wedge. But yeah,
That's
I think
unfortunately an opportunity that Action SA have not taken. I mean, the opportunity was there to become like the conservative opposition, the only conservative opposition in the benches, as opposed to MK and the EFF. But it doesn't seem that their advisors advise them in that way. I just saw here a comment from Leonard Kotso, who said ZB de Toey proposed something similar back in G63. Yes, fascinating thinker there. Actually got a book recommendation from Ernst Roots that I still need to read. The book's name is Die Nuwe Toekoms, Perspektief op die Afrikaner by die Eeuwwisseling by ZB de Toey. Still have to read it. Good friend of, I think, of both Koos Malan and Dani Goosen, so he was in those circles. But I have to read that book as soon as I'm done with Herman Gilume's The Afrikaners. But thank you for that comment, Leonard. And then there's also just a few comments I highlighted before we continue, Rob. There's a comment here from Stefan Jacobs, who says we should stop the vibes from taking over the gees in Afrikaans schools. Absolutely. Gees should always be paramount over vibes. And Franco de Klerk asked, do young people still feel strong about Afrikaans? In my experience, yes, there seems to be a opvlam in Afrikaans, a resurgence in Afrikaans among young Afrikaners, but particularly within the context of actually what's happening in the wider West is young people are looking for identity, they're looking for where they belong, and a lot of Afrikaners are rediscovering Afrikaans music, Afrikaans films, Afrikaans theatre. You can just see how cram-packed full the AfriForum theater is whenever there's a production there, and there's a bunch of young people. It's not just old people. Someone, Piet Swart in the comments also mentioned music festivals, Afrikaans music festivals being still very popular. Look also at the new Afrikaans music from Bok van Blerk and from Bernice West, very, very patriotic about Afrikaner culture, very strong focus on culture and identity. And that song from Bernice West called The Afrikaner Maak So got 3.4 million views on YouTube alone. That's not even talking about the music streaming services in 8 months. And there's only 2.7 million Afrikaners. So that tells you quite a bit. I mean, that's playing all over the Afrikaner sphere. Over the speakers. But yeah, those are some of the comments that I wanted to highlight. And Rob, the other thing that I wanted to pick your brain on, and particularly, you mentioned this in the piece, but I want for this conversation for you to elaborate again on it. And that is the difference between the classical liberal idea of checks and balances and this other system that you described of consociationalism.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, in theory, one has, and I mean, this is endlessly discussed in liberal literature, and it really comes downstream from America, but a lot of it is inherited from the English legal tradition, because the English don't have an absolutist tradition like the French and the Germans have on the continent, but The broad idea is that various institutions and classes will check each other's power. Like in Great Britain, the tradition was actually more directly that the various class interests would check each other. In the United States, class being more fluid, the idea is, okay, well, we're all equal now. We don't have the class system anymore. So now it has to be institutions which do it for us. And the problem is that the institutions have to recruit people from the same schools. So you have everyone who ends up in the federal elite passes through the Ivy League, and the Ivy League shares the same academic and intellectual community, which means that everyone is stamped with the same imprint. And everyone who occupies all of those institutions has broadly the same way of thinking. And so where they feel they can bend the rules is not going to line up with where everyone else feels they should. And they don't see themselves in terms of a class. They see themselves as experts. And the same thing happens in South Africa. You've got this idea that, it's not that we are the ruling class and we've got to be careful with how we exercise powers that might impact people on the ground. It's more like, well, actually, I'm an expert on how to run the government, because I have this fancy degree, and therefore, I mean, look, I'm the only reason that I ever bring up my my credentials when I'm talking on social media or anything like that is just sort of say, well, actually, they're not worth all that much. So it's like, well, okay, I've got a master's degree, and yes, you have to write a lot of crap, and you have to write kind of well, but they don't actually teach you a hell of a lot. They don't really teach you a great degree about how the world works. You only get out of it as much as you really put into it, and a lot of that you can get without going to university. So I think look, degrees are overrated. Expertise is overrated. The thing is that people have an unconscious bias in which they know, like, oh, okay, well, these are the ideas that like real experts have. And then these people who come up with different ideas from as much hard work and critical insight, they don't count because those ideas smell slightly off, and you can see it with, if you want to understand this in a way that everyone online has some kind of experience of, if they've been around for a few years, is all of the waves of banning and censorship that come through whenever the latest thing happens. So you've got this entire class who somehow all agree exactly on what they are and aren't allowed to lie about in public. And I mean, they talk about disinformation and they use those kind of words. But what they're really saying is, okay, we're allowed to lie in this way about these things, but you're not allowed to lie in that way about those things.
These are the conclusions that the average person would have come to if he was not corrupted by disinformation, if he hadn't been listening to Tucker Carlson, or if he hadn't been reading Marula Media, then he would have gotten to these conclusions by himself. So therefore, it's not really coercion. It's not really a disinformation or messing with people's outcomes in elections. It's just setting things right. That seems to be the logic.
I mean, that's true, but I mean, I think a lot of that's just post hoc rationalization. I think a lot of people know where they're actually bending the truth and where they're refusing to look at things, and you learn to notice this in yourself if you've been through really big changes in how you see the world, and you realize it's really actually quite difficult to. I mean, if you're paying attention to yourself at any degree, I mean, I'm not saying I'm the most zen in this regard, but I think a lot of people do a lot more deliberate warping of their own worldview in order to protect the perspective they have than they really do. I mean, I at this stage, a lot of it, I have to admit that a lot of the way that I navigate political ideas and interpreting things that are going on is by gut feel. Because and this is kind of, and the way that I deal with that in my writing a lot is instead of just saying, oh, well, this is the fact, what I'll try and do is I'll go, okay, well, here's a prediction. And that's what I did with this article. That's the theme of this, is I said, well, look, let's assume that the logic of this interaction that Solidarity had with the ruling party represents a pattern that will be going forward. And I would like that to be a pattern going forward, because it saves us, it means that we can be protected from the worst things, because there are vested interests. The difference between Solidarity and any other organization in society that serves minority interests is that Solidarity does not rely on the donations of the wealthy. It doesn't rely on corporations. It doesn't rely on foreign NGOs. It doesn't rely on the local oligarchs. The DA relies on all three of those, which is why they tailor-make all of their policy to what those people like. They only reflect the voters' opinions to the extent that they have to, right? And the same is true of the ANC. They don't reflect their voters' opinions any more than they can get away with. Because the first things that they have to do is make sure that the internal structures are actually well fed so they don't revolt. And then they have to make sure that the investors don't run away. And then they have to do this. Solidarity is not beholden to anyone. Solidarity is beholden to its members who pay fees. And the the absolute sort of keen beady eye they have on the distant future of self-determination gives you a psychological approach that tends towards self-reliance, whereas all of the other elements of South African society have a consciousness of interdependence.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that solidarity is deluded into thinking that they live on an island somewhere. You guys know you don't think that way, but it's more that where you're pointing towards and where you want to go is a more independent route, whereas for everyone else, it's not quite as clear-cut as that. So what this means is that when you step into negotiations, you are probably the only organization that actually does represent ordinary interests, and does so seriously. The DA could let the entire country fall apart tomorrow. Their salaries would still be paid as long as the rand was stable. Right? Every institution could be destroyed as long as the rand was stable. They could still draw salaries, and at the end of it, they would have enough money to get overseas. Every single one of them that sits in office right now. The difference, that marks a difference because they also tend to have a globalist outlook. I mean, if you look at where they don't have any policies that are tailor-made to South Africa, philosophically speaking. They just adopt the UN social development goals as their manifesto, straight up. No chaser, no admixture, nothing. We are going to implement the United Nations social development goals. Nothing else. They don't have anything that sort of says we live in a country that has a history and a character. They say, oh no, we're just another branch of an international government erected by the United States to control international trade and international relations.
But I mean, that's one of the big that you mentioned earlier, that model of having hundreds of thousands of members that fund you and that being your funding base. I mean, that's one of the pieces of advice that I gave to a lot of Americans and Europeans when they asked, but we want to emulate what AfriForum and the Solidarity Movement is doing. And then I told them, and this is a shock to many Americans because they think of it completely differently. I'm like, you can't then rely on a handful of benefactors that give you the vast majority of your capital or your funds, because then they will call the shots. Then if you do something that they don't like, they will tell you, well, you have to go in this direction, otherwise we're going to change. We're not going to be supplying those funds anymore. And the risk that's in I mean, there's a lot of risks, very obvious, but one that people don't really think about, and you've touched on it now, is how fickle individuals are. They might believe in some especially billionaires, they might believe in some very fervently and zealously in one thing the one moment, and the next moment they're in a completely different trend. It's almost like all their little pet projects they have. It's almost like the flavor of the month. That's not how you build a future. That's how you that's how you have an erratic strategy for which direction you're going, and that's not sustainable. You can't. But with our membership base, it's a lot more sustainable and stable.
Yeah, I mean, look, you got to give credit where credit is due. I mean, one of the sort of legacy oligarchs, although he's a very junior one on the grand scheme of things, Rob Hasselhoff. I've often criticized him on Twitter. I mean, not that he knows I exist, but mainly because he keeps picking these like political flops, and for many years he was trying. It seemed to demonstrate a lack of real, how should I put it? It's like he wasn't deeply sort of spiritually invested into any clear political idea. He just really doesn't like the ANC, which fair enough. I mean, who likes the ANC, right? But I mean, you watch him backing Musi Maimane, and I kind of go, where are you coming from with this? Like, how do you think this is going to work out? Then he backs Gayton McKenzie, and like, okay, Gayton McKenzie is very sharp, he's very dynamic, I get it, but also I don't think he's ever going to be quite big enough to make it to be a decider of the future. I think he's got much more success ahead of him, but I don't think he's going to get that big.
So sorry, Rob, because we have
sorry, I have a point coming. I have a point coming down.
So there's two there's two questions that I still want to get to that I want to get your thoughts
on. Don't worry, I'll wrap up just a moment.
Sure,
I mean, all I wanted to say here is, like, look, if you look at all of them, whether you're looking at the Oppenheimers or Rob Hassel, I think that Rob Hassel is actually the most interesting because he has, like, the way he does business. I mean, some of his investments, they're actually extremely useful for like helping the country out, like the Winelands Airport, and he's putting up a network of airports in the Western Cape that I think are fantastic, incredibly useful for adding to, relieving the pressure on the freight system and making transport cheaper for, and so on. And I think these people do have a lot to add when they focus on how they're actually, how their interests are actually grounded in the economy. When they try and shift things to like big picture stuff, they're too detached from the ground level to actually have to actually operate on that level. And I mean, the Oppenheimers are similar. I mean, when they focus on sort of infrastructure and trade, they have a lot to say. When they focus on the meaning that structures the moral life of citizens, they're in cloud cuckoo land. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I mean, the other thing what I wanted to ask you on before we start wrapping up is particularly this quote from your piece that says, the most important factor favoring a conciliation is that none of the segments of the plural society compromises a majority of the population. And why I find that particularly interesting is that, as many of my colleagues within the solidarity movement have said, there actually is not a majority in South Africa. It is a country of different segments. The whole idea that it's a black majority and a white minority is not a very accurate way of looking at South African politics. The black majority is quite segmented, very starkly in many cases along cultural lines. I mean, you can just look at a cultural. I mentioned this the other day on an SABC interview. I can't remember what the show's name was, but I was on SABC News for a panel discussion, and I made this point where one of the panelists was constantly trying to make this point that Black South Africans are united primarily in their racial identity. And my point was, no, if you look at a language map, and language and culture in South Africa are pretty much the same thing. If you look at a language map of South Africa, after 30 years of freedom of movement, you can live and move anywhere you want. The different cultures still conglomerate or concentrate in very particular areas around where most of their culture lives. The same goes for even a place like Soweto. If you look at a culture map of Soweto and you overlay it over the map of Soweto, you see that the different cultures congregate in different areas of Soweto. That's just the reality of South Africa. Yeah. That's the reality of that has been the reality of South Africa since the start, and it still is today. But it's a very, very fringe group. It's a very small group, but because they are the educated, or more of the tertiary educated elite within South Africa, have this weird narrative that clashes with that actually no, it's the people are mostly organizing around their racial identity. Therefore, we should talk about the black majority, the white minority, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't translate to reality. But you might be able to enlighten me a little bit. Does this come just from a disconnect from reality, as in these are the types of theories and ideas you can only really, or conclusions that you can only really come to if you only surround yourself within intellectual bubbles? Or is there genuinely a worry from these people pushing this narrative of like a black majority, white minority, and not and explicitly ignoring the cultural element there? Does that come from a place where they understand this concept that you're talking about here, that the most important factor favoring a conciliation is that none of the segments of the plural society compromises a majority of the population, and they're pushing and pulling to have that consolidated majority identity, which then makes this type of decentralization of power impossible?
Yeah, look, I'm going to mildly burst your bubble here, because the way that I actually framed it is I quoted extensively from a review of Leipert's work, which in turn quotes him saying this back in like 1970 something. And he says, oh, well, there's all of these little groups in South Africa. None of them comprise a majority. They can all negotiate. It'll be, it'll work out. And then he sort of like in a throwaway thing at the end of the sentence kind of says, well, as long as they don't form a black, nationalist consciousness, you should be okay. The thing is that they really, really have. And look, culturally, there are big differences, but the way that people organize politically is around the idea of black identity. And you can even look in Zululand, where the cultural differences mean they'll align politically differently, but the ideas around which they organize is primarily going to be about blackness and specifically unity. So, I mean, the overwhelming success of the MK party kind of demonstrates that. I mean, yes, they want to see their own people, they want to see their own nation represented in the party, and that's why Zuma was so popular there. But the other side of this is that actually unity is the most important thing for them. And for as long as white people are still around in South Africa and are still major players, the key distinction in South African society will be race. Until we become a political irrelevancy, that is going to be the main sort of thing that people organize around, because we stand out like a sore thumb and people have grievances against us. And, you can sit and talk about, to what extent it's deserved or undeserved. I don't think that matters, at least for our purposes. I think the point here is just, it's a fact. Okay. We are seen as the black-white line is seen as the major distinction, and colored and Indian people, as far as politics is concerned, not necessarily an interpersonal level, but where politics is concerned, they're judged by their proximity to black or white. This is something a lot of people don't talk about very bluntly, but it's true. And so, what happened? What's very interesting when you look at balance of forces is that the domestic white population has slipped below 50% ownership of the economy several years ago now. There's a lot of international ownership of the economy, a lot of it white as well, but the domestic white population has slipped below the 50% ownership mark of urban housing property, shares on the stock exchange, various markers like this. So the balance of forces where power is really negotiated up at the top is kind of at a tipping point. And the only way that you can override those kind of economic factors is when you are, and those institutional representation factors, is if you are very, very well organized. And it's an old sort of principle from
There's Robert's
sorry.
Are you back? Yes, he's back.
Yeah.
You
Let me
continue?
just check that the right sorry about that. The microphone cable is
We haven't lost anything. You were muted for literally a second, so you can just continue your train of thought there.
No, I mean, it was like there's an observation from elite theory. It's a cluster of sort of political thinkers, mostly from Italy, who have a certain way of looking at how power works. But there's an observation that I think holds true at every level of society, and that the school of thinking comes up with, which is to say, the organized minority beat the disorganized majority 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100. And the thing about the solidarity movement is it is very organized, right? And and it has a sort of decent stack of representation that gives you the ability to negotiate with this kind of fractured factional organism known as the ANC. I mean, anyone trying to go directly up against a modern state is immediately at a disadvantage, because the state, the government, in almost every case, is a more organized minority of the population than any other grouping. That's why the state sort of tells us what to do, because they are the most organized element in society. So by organizing very efficiently, what the movement's done is they've turned themselves into something that can represent a section of the population, potentially in great disproportion to their actual size, which is what you need. you need to be able to represent yourself in disproportion to your size, because we are what? If we take all minorities, we're 20% of the population. If you take white people, it's 7 to 8%, depending on how much you trust the latest census. And Afrikaners is what, like 4%? 4 or 5%, depending on who's doing the counting. And if you're that small a population, you've got to be very, very good at boxing your corner, because it's very easy to walk all over you. I think people forget, successful minorities that slip below 10% of the population immediately become very vulnerable everywhere in the world. And so your capacity to organize and fight for your interests and to say no very firmly whenever someone treads on your toes, it's very important. It's the reason that Jews in politics tend to have an incredibly bristly, and to non-Jews, it'll seem like an almost hysterical response to things. But it's one of those things where you cannot hold on to that influence in society unless you are very, very sort of existentially anxious about your position. And the thing is, with Afrikaners for many years, and white people in general, we completely lost any kind of self-confidence in asserting our interests in the society. We felt very sorry for ourselves and everything, or guilty, depending on which people we're talking about. And so my little sort of internal barometer for our levels of confidence is the celebration of the Day of the Vow. How many people show up in a given year? So at a certain point, it dwindled to almost nothing.
Yeah, there's a fascinating. I saw an article from 1994 in the Beeld, one of the biggest Afrikaans newspapers, and the headline was in 1994, and I'm translating now: the last Day of the Vow celebrations are marked by sadness, because there's only 500 people that showed up in 1994, and then in 2022. There was 10,000, no, 2022, there was 10,000 people that showed up. 2021, there was 10,000. 2022, there was 20,000 at the Voortrekker Monument. And then in 2023, the third largest crowd in the history of the monument, with 32,000 showing up. So there's that resurgence that I was talking about earlier, again, in regards to the question. There was a comment about that as well. Meerkat Sevi said, young people from Afrikaans families are unaware of the initial battle to establish Afrikaans as a language. The older generation carries an inherent loyalty to heritage, tradition, and language. But I wanted to add to that there is an appreciation for Afrikaans among young Afrikaners as well. I've seen it. I've experienced it. There is, when you are targeted, when you are a minority that is being targeted by the state, or that is under existential threat, then there's consolidation, and there's actually a positive response, often in regards to rediscovering many things from your culture and from your heritage. But I would say, for those that are interested, definitely go read up on the two Afrikaans language movements, die taalbewegings. There's a lot of literature, especially in Afrikaans, to go read up. I've scratched the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I've seen the ears of the hippopotamus in regards to my own research into those two movements, but it's fascinating. It really gives you a perspective on what it takes to will your own language reality into reality, by simply your dedication, willpower, and actually playing the balance of forces correctly. But Rob, before we get to the last comment in your piece that I wanted to discuss, there was a question here from Dagbreker who asks, is Rob going to attend the Day of the Vow sometime? I mean, there's hundreds of Day of the Vow festivals all across the country. I was a speaker at one last year, and I'm going to be one at another Day of the Vow commemoration festival this year again, which is a major privilege. I'm very honored that I was asked. But Rob, find the nearest Day of the Vow celebration near you and go attend.
Yeah, no, I'm sure I will. I mean, but for me, it's this is a funny point, because I've actually had a little argument with a couple of people online about this. There's And I think it ties into a point that was made earlier about, black identity versus various of African nationalisms, Zulu, Ndebele, Swati, whatever. Right? So there's an emerging sort of little intellectual trend on the margins where people are trying to bring back, Boer identity as distinct from Afrikaner identity. And some people sort of say, okay, well, it's kunstmatig. I mean, it's synthetic, this Afrikaner unity. And I sort of think, well, there's a risk in sort of pushing on that button a bit too hard. I mean, look, when I look at the Day of the Vow, I can readily admit, that there are different folkways there. And my family, the reason that I live here in Wellington, is that on that little farm, where we go, that little farm over there, born Piet Retief, and his brother who stayed behind at the farm is one of my forefathers, and it's just up the road there. And I've always felt sort of I can feel and see the divergence in folkways there. But I don't think, but I think the people who are moving in this direction are making a little bit of a mistake in letting the sort of regional cultural variations dominate a little bit too much. So I mean, for example, if you want to look at a lot of the movement that gave us the people who organized, for example, the Bitter Einders, leaders came from the Cape, Botha and Smuts, funny enough. And then you've got the Taalbeweging to begin with, without which everything would have been in Old Cape, sort of Old High Dutch.
Low describes the two language movements as the Afrikaners' third freedom war, the first and second Anglo-Boer War being the first two wars for freedom, and then the third one being the language movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's very interesting. One of the funniest little details when you read up about so if you read like Super Afrikaners or whatever, everyone will imagine that it started like the Broederbond began like in 1918. I think that's a bit silly. It was a political party in the Cape Colony before then. And before it was a political party, it was actually a farmers' union to protest brandy tax. It started in 1878 by Onze Jan Hofmeyer, who happens to be his niece was my great grandmother, who lived on that farm almost her entire life. And yeah, so there are these like little things where the fabric of your society, the identity that funnily, yes, you mentioned KWV. My great grandfather was one of the founding members of that cooperative.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, no, he was also as a representative for Wellington. His voice was the first one recorded in Hansard in the Parliament.
Very cool.
So that's a nice little. Anyway, sorry.
Rob, before we say goodbye, the last, I think this is the most powerful line for me in your piece, and I want you to share some of your thoughts there. So, reading directly from your piece, you said, the question here is what they are advancing towards, they being the Afrikaners in their organizations such as AfriForum and Solidarity. Yeah. The answer is the same as it has been for hundreds of years. The ability to determine one's own collective destiny. And that's the quote. I think that's the hinge. That's the crux of your entire piece. I think that's the heart of your piece right there.
Yeah, no, I think that's sort of it. But that's a nice sort of spiritual bow on the end. But I would like to hang a question mark on this though. And I mean, this is, I think anyone who's, in the movement who's worked with me for my little sort of research contributions has, heard this kind of, they've seen me bring up something similar before, which is I've always got this anxiety that the movement isn't consolidating hard power quickly enough. And naturally, I'm someone who's always looking for like the danger zones, how everything can go completely wrong. So naturally, I'm going to be more paranoid about these things than anyone else. But what I will say here is more or less that, and a lot of the things that I hoped I would see from the movement have emerged very quickly in the last maybe month or two, where the movement has realized the power that it plays and realized that the real opposition to the ANC at the moment isn't the DA. The DA are just a doorstop that they use to keep the drafts out from the MK, right? The ANC is in total power in government. They don't have any opposition except in any meaningful sense, except from outside the parliamentary system. So the liberals have been captured. The radicals are being taken apart by infighting and, lawfare and all kinds of stuff. But the real opposition is now from outside the parliament. And it's a very, very, what I suspect is that it's going to gradually get a little bit scarier as time goes on, because if you embrace this role, I suspect that you are going to be, you're going to start seeing yourselves get targeted a little bit more severely than you're used to. And so what I sort of hope people do is that, there's a, when you realize that you're about to take some sort of power role in society and you become part of the living constitution instead of an element of the community, it should frighten you, I think, just a teeny bit.
Well, I take heart from the fact that many of the leadership within the solidarity movement went through times where the things got a little bit more rough, a little bit more difficult.
No, I have a great deal of confidence in it, and it's one of those things where being that little bit scared is also where the excitement comes from that motivates you, that keeps you going forward, and it's cool times to be around. It really is, because I could go on for another hour about all of the sort of weird, fanciful theories that have come up in the West, where people have been looking for solutions to these problems. And then, here we've got an actual living example of this weird fantasy sort of political theory getting exercised over here.
Yeah, it's actually turning theory into reality. It's people actually getting going and starting something. It's not just, but what if this happens? But what if this happens? That eternal paralysis. I see it so many times when a lot of, especially Americans, because they seem to have a lot of psychological trauma regarding this, but I mean, for obvious reasons, when they look at what Solidarity and AfriForum are doing, what the Iranians are doing, they're like, but what if the state just comes and smashes everything and just destroys everything? But
on that note, I will say something. I'll give the ANC now a really big compliment. In the United States right now, they have this massive hurricane that's tearing through, North Carolina and whatever. And, people are dead. People have lost entire towns. And in order to preserve certain long-standing contracts that the federal government has with huge corporations that supply their, military and, rescue services, they prevent anyone from helping the survivors. They threaten them with arrest. What I would sort of say to anyone here, that's absolute pure evil. That's the kind of corruption that you will not find in South Africa. And I think this is something that, Hurricane Helene, thank you. This is something that I think we can be thankful for in South Africa, is that nobody could imagine the South African government arresting AfriForum or Gift of the Givers for helping people out in an emergency. And I think that's something to be enormously grateful for. And when the Americans sort of start getting concerned and they say, what if the government comes and takes it away? It's because they're used to having a government that is very comfortable doing things that are purely evil. And it doesn't happen every day that they do something of that scale of malice or callousness. But when it does happen, it is remarkable the degree to which they can ignore any degree of normal human morality. And I think even amongst the really nastiest elements of the ANC, they don't have the conviction to really go through with doing anything of the kind here. Even in lockdown, where you had them doing racially approved rescue financial rescue packages. That may be bad, but they're not going to come out and go, "Oh, you're not allowed to help here. You've got to let these people suffer from this, this, and this." No, if you've got a hand to lend to your fellow human being, even the worst of South Africans will let you lend that hand, and I think that says something.
Right, Rob, on that note, I'm going to read Leonard Kortz's comment. You said, Rob is my favorite optimist. So I think that is quite apt there.
I'm not an optimist every day. Some days I'm as black-pilled as anything.
Thank you for the comments,
yeah.
Leonard. They were very entertaining. Peter Schwartz says that the two of you buy from the same art gallery. No, both me and Rob are just appreciators of Cape Dutch architecture and it being captured in art. I actually bought this piece behind me for very cheap, and it's one of my favorites. I'm very glad to own it. And then Stefan Jakob says these live streams should be longer. The cool kids in the US do 3-hour podcasts. Yeah, my work, private life, and hobby balance just doesn't allow that. I'm just not chronically online enough to sit around to do a 3-hour podcast. I mean, if I had more time, I would definitely be chatting to Rob here for much longer. I mean, I find these talks fascinating and enjoyable, but got to balance all the things. And yeah, both me and Rob are married men. Also, I saw there was another comment here. Ted de Boer, who said it's now a category 5, the Milton hurricane. So prayers there with our American friends, especially within the range of that hurricane. I hope it's not a major tragedy. And then Rob, yes, we've reached the end of today's chat, but we've had so many chats on this show. This one just adds to that collection. I hope you have a great rest of your week. I found your piece very fascinating. I put the link in the description for anyone that wants to go check. My last question to you is just an administrative one, and that is, where can people find your words and your content if they want to read more, listen more, or see more of your work?
Well, all the links are on Twitter, or that's X now. I still can't call it X. It feels weird. No, so all of the links are on X. My handle, I just go under my name there, but the handle is at uMarhobane, which you won't need to remember. Just Google my name. There's also a little daily newspaper that I put stuff out on. It's I have occasional contributors, but it's mainly me. It's a very sort of a one-man band type thing at the moment. But anyone who has something to contribute, feel free. It's called the Cape Independent. It's where I publish most of my stuff, although occasionally if there's a really big article like this one, I'll stick it also on my Substack. And then I have a YouTube channel as well that I don't use very often, although I probably should sort of boot it up again and try and do some stuff on it. So there's a couple of people who've been begging me to finish that video essay series I started before I did consulting work. Yeah, so that's it. If you can spell my name, you can find me online, I guess.
Right. Yeah, Rob, thank you very much for your time and your insights. As I said, always a pleasure. And then also thanks to everyone that tuned in. Thank you for your comments and your questions and your inputs. It's always nice to add your comments and questions there on the screen, so it's part of the content. As just a rule of thumb, I don't read everyone's comments as in read them aloud on the stream. It just takes up too much time. There's too many interesting comments I would want to read, so I rather just put them on the screen, so they are there. They are part of the conversation, and I really do appreciate them. Thank you very much. And if you're watching and it's no longer live, you can still stay part of the conversation by and sharing your thoughts by leaving your thoughts and questions in the comment section. I read all of them, and I really appreciate the feedback. And yeah, it seems like the people in the chat really enjoyed the stream. And I see Francois de Klerk really knows his Afrikaner politics lore. He seems to be quite on top of that. I see everyone
is he the guy who quoted Zibi de Toy?
No, that was Leonard. But anyway, I see everyone really enjoyed the chat. Glad to hear it. Rob, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. Kind regards to your wife and your family. And I hope you have a great rest of 2024 as well when it comes to your writing and your publications and growing your various platforms.
Yeah, and hopefully monetizing it a little bit better.
All right. So thank you everyone for tuning in. And if you're new to this channel and you like this type of content, you can subscribe and you can also like. That helps out the show. And I'll see you guys. Is it? I don't think I have a episode next week. Do I? Let's see. There's somewhere where I take a little bit of a break. Let me just make sure. Sorry for keeping you now, Rob. I'd say that I'm gonna keep to an hour, but I just want to make sure I don't spread disinformation. Yes, so my next episode is going to be on the 22nd of October. So there's going to be a little bit of a gap between now and then. Next week, I'm unfortunately a bit busy with other projects to be able to have an episode. So the next episode is going to be on Tuesday, the 22nd of October, and that's going to be a chat with David Ansara from the Free Market Foundation about opposition in the government of national unity era, and it's going to be a perfect continuation, actually, of many of the topics that me and Rob were discussing here tonight.
Yes, I wonder what he makes of that little thesis of mine that Solidarity is the real official opposition.
I'll definitely ask him. I'll use the opportunity to ask. So you should also tune in, Rob, and I'll see you in the chat there. Chris Eiler says, Aris, is you in Pretoria? Yes, I am in Pretoria, and I'm hearing one of the first thunderstorms of spring rolling in here. I hope we get a little bit of rain. Go Dame Fuss. Dagbreker says, cheers, gents. Great talk. Stefani says, thanks, everyone. And yeah, I think that's where we're going to end it. Cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless.
Right.